Hey there and welcome back to another Pixar video. And recently we saw the release of the latest film developed by Pixar and the latest installment in the Toy Story franchise via the spin-off film Lightyear. Now this film, released during the events of Toy Story 1, acts as a film within a film. This is the movie that Andy goes to see and quickly becomes his favourite film of all time, and thus he gets the tie-in toy of Buzz Lightyear, which in turn kicks off the events of the story and introduces one of the most iconic animated characters of all time. And when they first announced this idea, I didn't realise that this was going to be the case. I kind of assumed it was just going to be a fun spin-off, what-if kind of deal. Looking at what it would be like if Buzz Lightyear was a real person doing his galactic ranger things. And then a fair while ago, I learned that this wasn't the case, that it was film inception, the film within a film. And I thought that that idea on paper sounded really cool, a concept unlike many other mainstream films today, something you don't really ever see from these big name studios. And since Pixar's known for pushing boundaries and trying to think outside the box, this film felt like it was going to fit right in. I think the only real fear I had was that it would be too meta. By acknowledging that the film is a film within another film, you acknowledge that this film inherently isn't real, that the characters aren't real, that their journeys don't really matter. And you might be sitting there thinking, yeah, no shit, it's a movie, they're clearly not real. But usually when you do see a movie, you have to suspend your disbelief, right? In Toy Story, you acknowledge in your head that toys don't speak or move when you're not around. That Toy Buzz isn't actually a real person, but you need to put that aside to enjoy the story. It's just part of seeing a film. That contract between the performer and the spectator to engage with the narrative being told. But then, when you double down on that and acknowledge that not only the characters and their journeys aren't real, but are now doubly not real, as in, even in the fictional world of Toy Story, these characters don't exist, I feel like it poses a real risk of the audience not being able to emotionally engage as readily, as it inherently lowers the overall stakes, the same way that a prequel that uses all of the same characters has inherently lower stakes. You know that nothing too awful is going to happen to the characters, because you've already seen them before. And if you haven't, well, there is your character that gets killed off, so don't get too attached. It just serves to create another hurdle for the film to leap over to try and get the audience to engage. And obviously, if you do have a really good storyline or really engaging characters, you can move past this to create a really good concept and draw in the audience regardless of what obstacles need to be overcome. The only problem is it just becomes harder to do so. Things have to be more impressive in order to overcome that barrier. And being fair, I do think that Lightyear does manage to do this for the most part, even if it does stumble from time to time and struggles to make you care about some of the various different characters, especially the characters pre-time skip. But despite this, I was still pretty hyped up for the film. I love Toy Story. I love Buzz Lightyear. Hell yeah, let's do this. And then I went to see the film and yeah, I liked it well enough. It was decent, but ultimately nothing special. I don't think it was bad, but I just don't think it lived up to that nostalgic hype. By tying it into Toy Story 1 and by telling the audience that this is the film that got Andy hyped for Buzz and kicked off the events of the Toy Story franchise, the whole thing, that creates a promise of greatness. And whilst the film wasn't bad by any means, at least in my opinion, it doesn't really live up to the legacy either. And I think that for the most part, this is the general consensus. It's fun, but it doesn't hit those same highs that we've really come to expect from both Pixar and any media that's tied into the Toy Story franchise. Currently, it's sitting at 77% on Rotten Tomatoes, at least when I wrote this. And it has a 5.3 out of 10 on IMDb, which in my opinion is a bit overly harsh. Although the Rotten Tomatoes audience score is a fair bit better at 87%. So the film isn't considered bad, I think, but more just average. It lacks that distinct Pixar magic that helps set their films apart from the crowd. And so I think that's why it's had a lesser critical response. But it's not only that, because it also came across as a bit of a box office disappointment. In its opening weekend in the North American market, the market that matters the most if we're being brutally honest, statistics indicated that it was going to gross around $70 to $85 million, just in its opening weekend. But it ended up with only $51 million, which, whilst it's not bad, after all it was still second on the charts after Jurassic World, it still really isn't an ideal number for a studio that's frequently smashed the box office, especially when you look at the Toy Story franchise, which often creeps up to billion-dollar earnings. It's clear that financially, at least for now, it's been a little bit of a disappointment. It's not a complete failure, it's not a flop or a bomb, but it's certainly not tracking quite as well as they would have liked, I think. And that's a shame, but honestly I'm not really sure why people aren't flocking to this like I expected. because I doubt it's the quality. It's too soon for that kind of thing, isn't it? Many films far worse than this have managed to do well at the box office, at least at this early stage, but maybe it's just one of those things. But anyway, moving on, there are going to be spoilers abound during this review from this point onwards, so yeah, if you haven't seen the film, or you actually care about being spoiled, I would watch the film first. If not, well, you've been warned. So, Lightyear, as you might have noticed, follows the story of Buzz Lightyear, a galactic ranger who finds himself stranded on a dangerous planet alongside his crew, and who, out of guilt for his mistake which got them stranded in the first place, works tirelessly to create a hyperspace fuel which will let them leave the planet forever. However, after testing this fuel, instead of the promised 4 minutes which should have elapsed, due to the effects of time dilation, he's in fact been gone from the planet for 4 years, whilst he's not aged at all. Determined to solve the puzzle, he assigns his robotic therapy cat Socks as his own personal scientist who's going to work on synthesizing a potential fuel, whilst he continues to test other fuels made by the science division over the next 62 years. Over these years, his friends and co-workers steadily grow older, having families and developing lives together, whilst he remains the same until eventually, that old guard is dead and gone, and he's the last of the original settlers to remain. After the project's cancelled, just as the correct fuel's created, Buzz steals his starship for one final flight to prove that it works, going to lightspeed and returning 22 years later to find his home under siege by an army of killer robots led by the robotic emperor, Zurg. Joining forces with a ragtag band of the colony's reserve defense force, members of which include the granddaughter of his longtime friend, an elderly convicted felon doing community service, and a fresh recruit, Buzz is able to create a plan to attack the Emperor's starship and save the colony, only for him to be captured by the Emperor, who's revealed to be him, but from an alternate future, and who's come back to change the past and redeem his own mistakes, regardless of whether this is wanted by the people or not. Present Buzz, having realized that this planet is the colony's home now, doesn't react well to this, and the two battle, with Buzz destroying the fuel and supposedly killing Zurg. He then returns to the planet and reforms the Galactic Rangers with his new crew, with their goal being to keep the colony, and its area of space, free from any sort of threat. And thus, the film ends on a happy note, except for Zurg's survival in the post-credits scene possibly setting up for a sequel. I guess that all depends on how well this film performs. And I'll be honest, there were a lot of elements about this film that I really enjoyed. I wouldn't say that the story was really one of them though. It wasn't that it was bad, but more underdeveloped, formulaic, derivative. It didn't draw me in. It didn't excite me. Aside from Zurg being Buzz, I was really surprised by that more than anything else. But the rest of the film didn't wow me in the way that Pixar's known for. It was like the film was content to skate by on nostalgia and not put in the effort to really create an engaging storyline. But overall, the narrative itself isn't the only thing that suffers from this. It's also the characters. And for the most part, I don't think the characters are all that well developed. Buzz, of course, gets the most story progression as the title character, and he's the character who drives the narrative forward with his actions, and over the course of his journey, he changes on a fundamental level. He overcomes his desire to work alone and avoid rookies by teaching his new team how to be effective Galactic Rangers. Along the way, he also learns that it's better to let go of the past and to enjoy the present, and that whilst he's been gone, the rest of his crew lived full lives on their own. But he missed out on sharing that experience with them as he kept going forward through time trying to find a solution. But by meeting and interacting with his best friend's granddaughter, and learning that Alicia lived a happy life, and that the only thing missing was him, he comes to the conclusion that the colony shouldn't be wiped away. And thus, he battles against future Buzz to preserve the world that's been built over nearly a century of settlement. But then putting Buzz aside, Socks provides fun comic relief and is very cute, but he doesn't have much depth to him. And it's the same with Izzy and the new generation of Rangers. They're fun, and they have their moments, but since they're introduced almost halfway through the film, we don't really get as much time to flesh out their characters, and in many ways, they come across as kind of two-dimensional, simply stepping stones for Buzz in his own personal journey. Even Izzy, she's there to remind Buzz that Alicia had a life without him, and a happy life at that. And yes, she has a side plot about trying to live up to her legacy, but in the end, even that seems to be about proving herself worthy to being Buzz's partner, just like her grandma was. To me, those characters are fun and engaging comic relief with some dramatic moments, but they're quite shallow beyond that. And honestly, it's the same or even worse for the pre-time skip characters. We don't really spend enough time with them to truly develop any sort of rapport, any sort of emotional connection. I feel like the whole time skip thing was trying to do the same thing that the married life montage does during Up, trying to make you feel like shit because the characters died that was so important to the protagonist. But that isn't really what ends up happening. Instead, we kind of just slowly watch her die, and yeah, it's sort of sad, But at the same time, you don't spend all that much time with her, and she's almost immediately replaced in the story by her granddaughter. And yeah, they kind of try to do a storyline where it makes it clear that Izzy's not replacing Alicia and she's her own person, but they fill the exact same role in Buzz's life. It's not like where Doug and Russell fill the void of Allie in Carl's life, but still feel unique and different. Izzy has a different personality, yeah, but her role is the exact same. And thus, it becomes harder to care that the original character was even dead. However, that being said, it's not all average. There was still a bit of fun to be had in the story. I thought one of the best elements was that in the end, Buzz was his own enemy. Much like Buzz has to reconcile the fact that this planet is his home now, for better or worse, and that he kind of wasted 90 years chasing his dreams of personal redemption, he also has to face off with a physical manifestation of that as he fights against the Emperor Zurg, a future Buzz who did not meet Izzy, and therefore didn't realize how happy Alicia was. He didn't realize that his absence was the main problem with the colony, that they didn't have him there. He wasn't there for his friends, and they missed him. But by appearing and preventing the security forces from trying to arrest present Buzz, he gives himself the opportunity to learn this, and to change his fate, and thus, it sets him on a collision course. And this ethical battle really does make a compelling finale. I think I just wish it was a bit longer, and the early stages were not as detailed. The future characters, the ones that have more relevance if they ever do sequels, and the ones whose actions truly matter most, I think they're the ones that needed the most time. And I think this is why the story falls flat to me. The two halves of the film don't really complement each other quite as well as would be expected, and thus, it lacks a certain emotional X factor. But that being said, whilst there are still problems with the depth of the plot, it is still fun. It just isn't as deep as you'd expect from a Pixar movie. But that aside, literally everything else, as usual, fired on all cylinders. The film looked absurdly good. The score was great. And honestly, the acting was awesome too. I mean, by the end, I honestly had briefly forgotten what Buzz's original voice had sounded like in the first place, and Chris Evans had managed to usurp it. I mean, sometimes films like this do have a few characters that have a pretty dodgy sounding voice. A voice that makes it clear that the actor didn't really care and just wanted the easy money. But I didn't feel like this here. And it really does enhance the experience. And so, whilst the narrative does let down the film, I can't ever call it bad, because everything else works so well. I just think that maybe the story was a bit better suited to being a short film, rather than a feature-length presentation. But, that's the end of the video. And I would like to say that these were just my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What did you think of the film, if you've seen it? Do you agree that it's good, but not great? Or maybe you disagree completely. Maybe you think it's the best film ever, or the worst. I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.